Artists often ask for device speed recommendations for brows, eyeliner, or lip procedures. How do you determine the proper speeds for each of the procedures? Contrary to what a lot of people believe when they're first starting out, there are actually no right settings, as there are so many different various factors involved in selecting the ideal speed setting on your machine. So let's break it down simply.
So number one, when you're choosing your machine speed breakdown that you want to consider is your needle's configuration. What I mean by that is if you're choosing a needle with larger needle grouping, it will require a higher speed to deposit pigment. If you're going with a lower grouping, the lower the speed on your machine. So for example, an F7 has a very high grouping of needles. So there's 7 needles in one actual cartridge. Whereas our M1s has one single needle within the cartridge. So that is a much lower configuration of needles compared to a 7 grouping.
Don't stress if you miss any of these steps, as you can download our free 8-week boot camp that has additional pro techniques and tips to perfect your technique and scale your business in the description link below.
Number 2 that we want to consider is that we always want to look at the client's skin condition. So always assess your client's skin type first. If the skin is sensitive, where it would easily bruise or bleed, for example, more mature clients would be a really good explanation for bruising or bleeding, or a higher risk of bruising or bleeding, I should say. Let's start at a lower speed, which creates less trauma on the skin naturally. If the skin's a lot thicker or has scar tissue, start at a higher speed because you need more power in order to puncture through. Number 3 is to consider the scope of work that you're going to be doing. Are you lining or are you going to be shading? If you're lining, you're going to start with a lower speed, as the lining are created with higher density dots. And if you remember when we were talking about the needle configurations, your lining needles will generally have only 1 or 2 needles in it, and you want to use a lower speed. Whereas if you're shading, you're going to be working at a higher speed. It also requires a faster hand movement, and your shading needles will have more needles in the configuration, which again aligns with speed. Number 4 is your hand speed. Okay, so if I naturally work really slow, I want to slow my machine down so that if you think about the needles puncturing the skin and depositing ink, if I move too slow while it's working, it's going to create a blowout or over penetrate and create darker lines in certain areas. Whereas if you move really fast naturally, as opposed to somebody who works a little bit slower, you're going to want to turn your machine speed up when you're working. The reason for that is, again, if you work too fast and the needles don't have time to penetrate and deposit the ink, you're actually going to end up with very uneven work, or you're not going to have enough pigment deposited into that area. So make sure your hand speed correlates. If you work faster, faster speed. If you naturally work slower, slower speed, so that the needles can actually do the work that they're meant to do in the right time frame, correlated with your hand speed.
So let's recap. There are 4 things to consider when choosing your speed setting on your PMU tattoo machine. Number 1, needle configuration. Number 2, skin type. Number 3, type of work you're doing. And number 4, your natural hand speed. Don't forget to download our free 8-week boot camp in the description below to learn more about this. If you want to learn more on needle breakdowns, you'll definitely want to watch our next video on needle breakdowns and configurations for optimal results in your PMU services. Let's take the guesswork out of what needles to use for each service.